Masha had always believed that the most dangerous moment in any person's life was not the dramatic one. It was not the moment of the accident or the confrontation or the loss that announced itself loudly and demanded to be felt. Those moments were terrible, but they were also clear. You knew what they were. You knew what they required. You moved through them because the movement was obvious even when it was hard. The most dangerous moment was the quiet one that came after. The moment when the emergency was over and the clarity was gone and you were simply standing somewhere with nothing left to do and nowhere particular to go and the full weight of everything that had happened settling onto you without the adrenaline that had been holding it off. She had been standing in that moment for 3 days when he found her. Her name was Masha. She was 33 years old and she was sitting on a fence post at the edge of a dirt road in the territory of Krasnogorsk with a single bag at her feet and the particular stillness of someone who has been moving for a very long time and has finally stopped, not because they have arrived somewhere but because they have run out of road. She had come from the east. That was as much geography as the last 3 days had provided her. She had been on a stage that had taken her as far as the last town, which had been small and unwelcoming in the specific way of towns that have seen too many people passing through with not enough to offer. And she had spent one night in a boarding house that charged more than she had, and in the morning she had counted what remained in her purse and understood that the number was not sufficient for the next stage of a journey she had not finished planning. The journey had a beginning that she did not discuss. It had begun with a marriage that had seemed like one thing and had turned out to be another, which was a story so common in the territories that it barely qualified as a story at all, only a fact of the landscape, like bad winters and uncertain harvests. She had married at 27, moved to her husband's land, worked it alongside him for 5 years with the complete investment of someone who believes they are building something permanent, and had discovered in the 6th year that permanent was a word he had used with considerably less precision than she had understood. She was not bitter. She had made the decision not to be bitter because bitterness was expensive and she could not afford it. She was practical instead, which was more useful and only slightly less painful. She had left with what was hers, which was not much because 6 years of building something together had made the question of what was hers considerably more complicated than it should have been, and she had a cousin in the western settlements who had written once, 2 years ago, to say that the land there was good and the people were decent and that Masha should come if she ever needed to. She was going to the cousin. She had enough for the journey if everything went smoothly. Nothing had gone smoothly. The stage had broken an axle 2 days' travel from her destination. There had been a dispute about whether the company owed the passengers anything for the delay, and the conclusion of the dispute had been that they did not, or at least that they were not going to. She had walked the last 6 miles of the road because waiting for the repaired stage would have cost her the price of another night's boarding, and the arithmetic had not supported it. And now she was here, on a fence post at the edge of a dirt road, and her feet hurt and her bag was heavier than it had been when she started, and the western settlement was still somewhere ahead of her, and the road had reached a fork she did not recognize. She had a map. The map was not helping. She was looking at the map and the fork in the road and making calculations that were not resolving into anything satisfying when she heard the horse. He came from the right fork, which meant he was coming from the direction of whatever was down that road, and he was moving at the easy pace of someone returning from a day's work rather than going toward one, a man on a dark horse with the particular posture of someone who has spent enough hours in a saddle that it has become his natural way of existing in the world. He was perhaps 40, lean and dark-featured with black curling hair visible beneath a wide-brimmed black hat and the weathered quality of someone who spent most of their time outside under the kind of sky that did not negotiate. He had a face that had been lived in considerably, not unkindly but thoroughly, the face of someone who had seen enough to have reached some conclusions about things and was not easily surprised. He slowed as he approached. He looked at her on the fence post with the direct unhurried assessment of the territories, where you looked at things properly because looking properly was how you stayed informed and staying informed mattered. He said, "You are lost." She said, "I know where I am going. I am uncertain about the road." He said, "Those are the same thing out here." She considered arguing with this and decided against it because it was probably true. She said, "I am trying to reach the Petrov settlement. My cousin lives there. I was told it was west of here." He said, "It is west. It is also a day's ride from where you are standing. On horseback." He looked at her bag and her feet and the road behind her with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. He said, "On foot it is more than that." She said, "I know." He said, "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" She said, "I will find somewhere." He looked at the road around them and then at the sky, which was doing what late afternoon skies did in that season, moving toward evening with a speed that the terrain around them left entirely exposed. He said, "The nearest town with a boarding house is 4 miles back the way you came." He said it not as an obstacle but as information, the way practical people delivered difficult facts. She said, "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My place is half a mile down the right fork." He said it the way he said everything, directly and without decoration. He said, "Come home and eat supper. You can sleep in the spare room, and tomorrow I will take you as far as the Petrov land." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steady patience of someone who has made a reasonable offer and is prepared to wait for a reasonable response without pressure in either direction. She had been raised to be careful. She had been raised to know that accepting the hospitality of strange men on empty roads was the subject of a great many cautionary stories, and that cautionary stories existed because the things they describe had happened. She had been raised to know all of this, and she also had 3 days of road behind her and insufficient funds for another boarding house and fate that had been communicating with her for the last 2 hours in increasingly urgent terms. She looked at him again. She had been reading people for 33 years. She had been wrong before. But she had also learned that there was a difference between the stillness of someone who was hiding something and the stillness of someone who simply did not have anything to perform. This man was the second kind. She was as certain of this as she was certain of anything that could not be proven. She picked up her bag. She said, "I accept." "Thank you." He nodded. He dismounted with the easy economy of someone for whom this was as ordinary as standing up from a chair, and he took her bag from her without asking, which she might have objected to but which was done so matter-of-factly that it did not feel like presumption, only like someone carrying a thing that needed carrying. They walked the half-mile to his place, she on the road and he leading the horse, and he did not make conversation for the sake of filling the silence, and she did not either, and the silence between them was the kind that belongs to people who are comfortable with the world as it actually is rather than as it is supposed to sound. The place was a working ranch, modest in scale and completely functional, the kind of property that had been built by someone who knew what they needed and had built exactly that and nothing more and nothing less. There was a house, a barn, a fence line that had been recently repaired, a kitchen garden that was well tended in the way of something that was taken seriously. She looked at it and understood things about him without being told them, that he worked hard and consistently and that he did not waste, and that the place had been managed by one person for long enough that it had taken the shape of that person's habits. His name was Alexei. He told her this in the kitchen where a fire had been banked and only needed building up, which he did with the same economy he brought to everything. He said, "I will see to the horse. There is water in the pitcher and bread on the shelf if you cannot wait." She washed her face and hands in the basin by the door and stood for a moment in the kitchen of a stranger's house and felt the particular quality of a place that was clean and functional and entirely without pretension, and found that it suited her considerably better than pretension would have. She found things in the kitchen and she began to cook because she had been raised to contribute, and because standing still now that she had stopped moving felt like a thing she needed to ease into gradually. He came back from the barn and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at what she had done and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You did not have to do that." She said, "I know." He said, "It smells considerably better than what I was going to make." She said, "What were you going to make?" He said, "Something sufficient." He said it without self-deprecation, only as an accurate description of his usual culinary standard. She almost smiled. She had not almost smiled in 3 days, and the almost was larger than it should have been for such a small thing. They sat at the table and ate, and the window behind them showed the last of the evening light on the mountains and the pasture and the fence line, and the food was warm and real, and the kitchen was quiet in the way of kitchens where something honest was happening, and she thought that sufficient was exactly the right word for a great many things she had been missing, and that sufficient, when you had been doing without, was not a small thing at all. He said, "Your cousin. The Petrov settlement. Have you been there before?" She said, "No. I have only the letter she sent 2 years ago." She looked at her hands on the table. She said, "I do not know if she is still there. I do not know what I will find when I arrive." He said, "But you came anyway." She said, "I had nowhere else to go." She said it plainly, without self-pity, only as the accurate statement it was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I came here 11 years ago with less than that." He said, "I had nowhere else to go and no letter from a cousin. I had a horse and the tools in the barn and the information that the land was available." She said, "And you stayed." He said, "The land was good." He said, "And after a while the place became mine in the way that places do when you put enough of yourself into them." He said, "It stopped being somewhere I had ended up and became somewhere I had chosen." She looked at him across the table in the kitchen of his ranch with the mountains behind him in the last of the evening light, and thought about ending up and choosing, and the question of whether those two things were as different as they appeared, or whether they sometimes turned out to be the same thing described from different points in time. She did not say this. It was too large for a first supper. She simply thought it and put it away for later. He showed her the spare room, which was small and clean with a window that looked out at the barn and the sky beyond it. He said, "The bed is good. I replaced the mattress in the spring." He said this as useful information, and she received it as such. She said, "Thank you, Alexei." She said it with the completeness that the situation warranted, and he received it with the same nod he had given her earlier, the nod of someone who understood the completeness and did not need to expand on it. She slept better than she had in 3 days. Better, if she was honest, than she had in considerably longer than that. In the morning he had coffee on and bread warming by the fire, and he was already dressed for the day's work because he was the kind of man who was already dressed for the day's work when the day began. She came into the kitchen and he said, "We can leave when you are ready. The Petrov land is north of the third ridge. I know the road." They rode out in the early morning, she on his spare horse which he had saddled without comment, and the land around them was wide and clear in the particular way of early mornings in that country, every distance visible and every sound carrying further than it did later in the day. She found the cousin's farm at the end of a track off the main road, a small place with smoke coming from a chimney and chickens in the yard, and her cousin Vera standing at the fence with her hand shading her eyes against the morning sun. And the recognition that crossed Vera's face when she saw Masha was the recognition of someone who has been half waiting for a thing and has just seen it arrive. Alexei stopped his horse at the edge of the track. He said, "You have found it." She said, "Yes." He turned his horse to go and she said, "Wait." She said, "I want to ask you something." He waited. She said, "The spare room. Is it generally spare, or was it spare last night specifically?" He looked at her. The beginnings of something moved in his face that was not quite a smile but was the definite precursor of one. He said, "It has been spare for 11 years. She said, "That seems like a long time for a room to wait." He said, "Some things take the time they take." She looked at him in the morning light on the edge of her cousin's land and thought about ending up and choosing, and the road behind her, and the fork she had been sitting at on a fence post, and the way the right fork had turned out to go somewhere she had not known she was going, and that she was not, she realized with a clarity that surprised her, in any hurry to leave behind. She said, "I will need some time with my cousin." He said, "Of course." She said, "After that I would like to see the land you have been building for 11 years. If you are willing to show it." He said, "I am willing." She said, "Then I will come when I am ready." He nodded. He turned his horse. He rode back down the track in the morning light with the easy posture of someone returning to work that was waiting for him and that he was in no particular hurry about because the work would be there and he would be there and the day was long enough. She watched him go. Vera called her name from the fence. She picked up a bag and walked toward her cousin and felt something settling in her that had not been settled for a very long time. Not the settling of someone who has given up and stopped moving, but the settling of someone who has arrived somewhere and recognized it and chosen it with the full knowledge of what the choice meant. She thought about the fork in the road and the fence post and the map that had not helped and the horse coming down the right fork at exactly the right time. She thought that sometimes nowhere left to go was not the end of the road. She thought it was simply where the right road began. Vera put her arms around her and the chickens made their opinions known about the new arrival, and the mountains stood in the morning light exactly as they always had, and the kitchen in the small farmhouse smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the particular warmth of somewhere that had been waiting to have more people in it. She was home. Not the home she had come from. Not the home she had tried to build and lost. Something different and more honest than either of those. The home you find rather than the home you were given, which was, she had come to believe in the long road behind her, the only kind that truly lasted. She was home. And somewhere down the right fork of a dirt road in the territory of Krasnogorsk, a man in a black hat was doing his morning work on a ranch that had been waiting 11 years for a room to stop being spare. He was not in any hurry. Neither was she. And that, it turned out, was exactly right.